asking here on Newsnight today, what kind of administrative changes are needed to transform India? That's the big question on Newsnight. For that, we have with us in our studios today a very special guest, Dr. Arvind Virmani, who's the former Chief Economic Advisor. Thank you, Dr. Virmani, for joining us here on Newsnight today. That's the big question that we're really asking, looking at what the Prime Minister said today while inaugurating that Niti Aayog lecture series, asking for rapid transformation and not gradual evolution. Importance of that in the context of India being the fastest developing economy in the world at this point in time.
There are a couple of points here. One is that he is looking now, it seems, because the programs, a lot of programs have been set in motion, Digital India, etc., for the next 2-3 years. So in some ways, he's now looking beyond that. Let's say in a 10-year perspective and 15 years, Niti had said 15 and 7.5. So in that context, he is kind of trying to communicate this issue of how to transform India rather than just think incrementally. And the basic idea behind it is not a kind of an economist perspective, but a social perspective of the need to convince people that it's possible, and then what are the broad parameters of doing it.
You know, when we're talking about not just from an economic perspective, but also about transformation of mindset, which is what he highlighted today. And this is not the first time the Prime Minister has actually talked about incremental changes. I mean, earlier on, so when he spoke to Niti Aayog, he talked about, when he talked about the vision of the Niti Aayog, he wanted more than just incremental changes in the plan that was to come about. Now, when we're talking about a more global perspective and how India should be in the big scheme of things, when he's inviting global leaders to come and talk at this stage, how important is it really from that perspective of taking India, catapulting India even higher?
So the two pillars of this transformation are the policy reform and the institutional, which you are mentioning, governance. So I'll come back. But on the policy front, what he's trying to elaborate something which he has pursued from the beginning. This earlier the focus on FDI. FDI is not just money; it's also ideas, it's technologies, it's new and different ways of doing it. Some of which may fail in India. But so this concept of globalization, how we can, and to some extent we've already benefited from it. So we have this traditional autarkic, closed way of thinking. So he's trying to communicate to the Indian public that we have to think and act more globally now. So that's the global part. And then the domestic part, of course, governance, institutions, he's emphasized. Institutions is actually a new thing in economic growth theory. Again, he's contrasting with the old way where the approach was save more, put more capital, and you'll grow. But the new way of thinking is that's just one small part of it. You have to think of the technological transformation, the productivity, and the institutions, among which obviously the government is most important.
But then in all this, how do you balance your indigenous strength, your indigenous aspirations with the kind of global perspective that you're looking at?
Yeah, so one of the great weaknesses which have become more and more pronounced over the last 40 years, I would say, over a long period, is this failure of governance. The people who are governing, the bureaucracies, etc., have become narrower and narrower and focused on their own little bit. So one of these transformational ideas is to give them a broader vision. For example, focus on growth. So even if you are doing some narrow thing, think of the impact on the overall growth of the economy. So this idea of make in India and ease of doing business. Why ease of doing business? It's not to just facilitate, make life easier for the businessman, but because it promotes growth. So instead of focusing just on your little area and trying to control everything, think of the bigger impact on growth. So again, this mindset transformation, the governance transformation, and new way of thinking.
And what he talked about also brainstorming with these different sections and coming up with new ideas, because Prime Minister has been a big proponent of innovation in every field. Looking at that, when he talks about the aspirations of the youth, how important does it really become? And particularly when we see all these global leaders also talking about the kind of strength that India has in its youth.
So there's two aspects of it in a sense. One is the more technological aspect, but I think in my view more important is because we have lots of youth the skill India mission or approach is critically important. Partly because we have long neglected the job skills. There's been too much of this. I don't want to use this word, but it's what we call a Brahmanical approach. Where everybody has to be higher and higher educated, rather than skills which will actually be useful in services, in production and manufacturing. So that for the youth, both aspects are important. Some who are more highly motivated may acquire more technological skills, but others just have to be able to do the job.
And when we're talking about these flagship programs of the government, do you think when we see these kind of events happening, we see an integration and taking forward of those ideas, whether it's Make in India, whether it's Digital India, whether it's Skill India, and then we see an integration and coming together of these ideas on a much larger platform?
Right. So exactly, that's a good way to put it. It's to integrate the lower level, the specific programs to a broader vision, which will take a little more time. But he's saying it may take time, but don't think of it as incremental. Think of it as transformative. So when we think forward 10, 15 years, think what the India could be like, and then keep that in mind in your day-to-day programs, the yearly programs, etc.
And you know what India could be like, what the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore also said, not just overtaking China, but also recasting global growth is what we could be going towards. So we'll have to leave it there, Dr. Virmani, but thank you so much for joining here on Newsnight today.